Well, greetings once again, and welcome to this, the fourth in the series on science, consciousness and ancient wisdom. This time I want to address the evolution of science itself. And so science has a lot to say about evolution, but it's important to remember that it too is evolving very rapidly on many different fronts. So if you recall the image we had in the first time and the second time as well of three circles overlapping each other, three circles representing science, consciousness and ancient wisdom. So I want to begin with a video. This video is about incredible discoveries about the nature of the biological structures, DNA itself.
Your body is made up of billions of tiny cells. Cells that work together to make up tissues, organs and systems. Almost every cell in your body contains the same DNA. The same DNA code. So how can cells that contain the same DNA be so different? What makes a bone cell, or a liver cell, a liver cell? Different cells use the information contained within the DNA in different ways. Some parts of the DNA in one cell will be active, but not in another. This genetic information is encoded within the letters or bases of our DNA sequence. Inside our cells, DNA is wrapped around proteins called histones. The DNA can be loose, allowing genes to be switched on, or it can be tight, causing genes to be switched off. One of the ways genes can be switched off is by adding tiny chemical tags called methyl groups, shown here as bright particles. Here the enzyme DNMT attaches to the DNA and a methyl group is transferred to a cytosine base that has rotated out from the DNA strand. This process called methylation mainly occurs where cytosine is followed by guanine or CpG sites. Each cell type has a unique pattern of methylation, and unlike the DNA sequence, which cannot be easily changed, the methylation or epigenetic pattern can be altered. Methylation and demethylation of DNA occurs in a delicate balance that is potentially influenced by environmental triggers such as diet or disease to affect gene expression. Here we see the enzyme TET binding to methylated DNA and causing a chemical change to the methyl tag. In cancer, the pattern of methylation changes. The DNA becomes highly disorganized as methyl groups are added and removed from the DNA. This causes some genes that should be off to be switched on, and some genes that should be on to be switched off. Although it is not possible to reverse the genetic changes that occur in cancer, the epigenetic changes can potentially be reversed with drug treatment. Epigenetic changes can also be used to identify cancer DNA for early detection and monitoring disease progression. Cancer drug treatments that target these epigenetic mistakes offer new and exciting ways to treat cancer, giving hope to current and future cancer patients.
So let's just remind ourselves that even while quantum physics has made enormous strides, it itself is laced with mystery. It explains many things in terms of mathematical models of reality, but it comes to the point where it can't tell us why these models apply. And also the fact that in the universe itself, around about 96% of the substance of the universe is regarded as being either dark energy or dark matter. So we haven't by any means got to the point of being able to explain everything that there is out there. So let's look at this iconoclast, Niels Bohr, who is one of the pioneers in quantum physics. And he had these delightful things to say. If quantum mechanics hasn't shocked you, you haven't understood it yet. Well, I think it's fair to acknowledge that probably nobody really understands it. And another one too, with maybe with a wicked wit here, with his eye just winking slightly, that a physicist is just an atom's way of looking at itself. And I think he had a clear idea that consciousness did in fact pervade the universe, because that was one of the really crucial things that quantum mechanics brought to us, which is the way that consciousness is inextricably linked to our observations of the universe. So here's a video of the iconic Dean Radin, who's worked a great deal with the Institute of Noetic Sciences and worked very much in that borderland between consciousness and science. The point being here that, as you'll see as the video is playing, that 90% of the population are interested in psi one way or another, but only 3% of the academic population is actually working on it. And so he addresses this very evident taboo on psi amongst mainstream science.
Science and the psi taboo. I'm going to read a story here. One Thursday morning about 4 a.m., I jumped out of bed, feeling as if I was dying. I felt as if blood or something was pouring down from my head, choking me, and I was trying desperately to get my breath. I grew very weak. I thought I must really be dying. My husband put me down on the bed where I rested, but felt so all gone. Then I thought my son had called saying, "Oh, Mama, help me," in such anguish. That was February 10th, and on the 12th we received a telegram saying our son was killed by gunshot in the head at 1 o'clock on February 10th. There is a 9-hour difference in time. I feel he called me as it was happening, as it happened, and I heard his groan and felt his dying. Well, what do we do with such stories? They're, of course, called psychic phenomena. They're abbreviated psi. There's a number of people who will consider it superstitious nonsense. I suspect typically in technical audiences that percentage is higher than in a general population, but it depends on whether you're asking people publicly or privately, which is part of the nature of the taboo in this topic. So there's some people who say it's superstitious nonsense. There are lots of other people who would say, well, no, my experience actually doesn't agree with that. It doesn't take very long to realize that popular culture is saturated with this topic. It's a compelling topic. And so the question is, why is that? And I will say that one of the things that we run into again and again as a scientist studying this is a taboo. Well, the taboo in science, as it does in any realm, it restricts the nature of inquiry, and it also restricts what ideas are acceptable. And as a taboo, this is not very good in science because science rests on informed consent or informed consensus. If an informed consensus is constrained because of a taboo, it means that science can't really make up a good decision about what's going on. It means that it also will create distortions in how the topic is reported, because especially among skeptical journalists, they don't want to be caught with their pants down. So it's extremely difficult to get accurate reporting on this topic in the science media. All this means is that the taboo is sustained. And this taboo has been sustained for over 100 years.
This is Dean Radin again, where he's looking deeper into the attitudes towards consciousness in the fields of science. And this also is very revealing, because it's precisely in this aspect of consciousness in the universe that theosophy and ancient wisdom in general has a major contribution to make, because it does place consciousness up there with matter and energy as primary elements in the emanation of the universe.
Well, imagine that you can put consciousness on a continuum. On the bottom axis is where is consciousness? And we say, well, maybe it's local or maybe it's not so local. And the vertical axis, we say, well, what is consciousness? Is it something that is caused or something that is causal? Down here in the bottom, we have all is matter. It's a material monism. Under this model, the mind and the brain are identical. This is the assumption of the neurosciences. When you start moving up on this scale, you bump into things that the neurosciences have difficulty in dealing with, things like creativity, intuition, and especially genius. If you look in the literature to find out what neuroscientists think about genius, and we're talking about Mozart-level genius, there is absolutely no response to that. We don't know how that can be. You go further up the scale towards non-local, you end up with things like psi, these strange experiences that people talk about. And then further up, mysticism, and now models that start to look like mind is not identical to brain, it's correlated with, but not identical. And all the way at the top is a mental monism or idealism. Well, here's Western sciences down here. It assumes that things are material, that we use objective methods, and the mind, in fact, is equal to the brain. Up here, roughly, is Eastern sciences, interested more in energetic or informational aspects of the world rather than material. Subjectivity is held in high regard, and mind is not equal to brain. So these two ways of looking at the world create theoretical boundaries. And you notice that I stuck psi into the Eastern sciences because it is compatible at that level. Whereas in the Western sciences, there's no room for it, and that's what sustains the taboo. From trained as a Western scientist, you look at these phenomena, and you cannot imagine any conceivable way that it can fit within the worldview that you were trained to understand. And obviously, that method is very powerful. You guys wouldn't have a job here, it wouldn't be no building here or anything if Western science wasn't extremely powerful, and so it's seductive in its power. But maybe Eastern sciences haven't been all that far off the mark either. So we both have our different tools. The tools in Western science have used fancy machines like an MRI to look inside the brain, to look at the material part of it. And the Eastern sciences are based more on contemplative practice. So in the West, when we look at that object and we say, well, how does that thing work? Our tendency is to take it apart, since that's what reductionism is good for. Well, what if it wasn't a brain that we were looking at, but more like that? It's this object. So from the West, we look at this object which is playing music. And so how do we go about understanding that? Well, the first thing is we imagine that there's music, there's somebody inside there creating the music. So we look for Led Zeppelin inside. We take it apart and we look for them, and we can't find them in there. What we find instead are circuits. And as our methods get better and better, we find that our ability to detect better and better circuitry gets better. And this is what we see in the neurosciences. Our pictures assume that we're seeing reflections of the thing which is generating the music. Somebody from the East would say, no, you've completely misconstrued what's going on here. The object is not generating music, it's receiving it. And now the important point here is that both sides might be right. What we see in the neurosciences are correlations. Well, even in the East, what they talk about are correlations that are going on, and we assume the direction of causation based on our theoretical assumptions. So which one of these two are right? I'm not so sure. Does the brain generate the mind, or does the brain receive or filter out something about some large mind out there?
Here we have a magnificent quote from The Secret Doctrine, which was Madame Blavatsky's iconic or perhaps main piece of literature. This quote is absolutely crucial and pivotal to the understanding of a more holistic understanding of the relationship between consciousness and science and ancient wisdom. Father, mother, spin a web, whose upper end is fastened to spirit, the lighter the one darkness, and the lower one to its shadowy end, matter. And this web is the universe spun out of two substances made in one. Born of the relationship of the two is Fohat, which emerges out of darkness to set spirit and matter into conscious relationship. As I say, this is a crucial concept which, to my mind, mainstream science needs to evolve into a comprehension and acceptance of. So the Theosophical Society itself has made some really vital contributions to this understanding of the bridges between consciousness and matter in the form of two iconic research projects. And the first is where Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant embarked upon a clairvoyant research investigation into the heart of matter itself. Now, early on in their discoveries of the powers of clairvoyance, the tools of the mind, as I like to put it, they discovered that they were able to crank up a magnifying faculty whereby they could investigate very, very small things, going down through the layers of the scale, down through the cells of the body, into the molecules, and then into the atoms, and then even smaller than that, into tiny ultimate particles, which they dubbed with the name of Anu, which is a Sanskrit word meaning just small one, or little one. So they discovered that when they looked at atoms in this way and went through to what they called the etheric level of reality, they got to a stage where there was the ultimate particle that could be described as a physical particle. If they cranked up the magnification even more than that, it stopped being in the physical world. This was extremely interesting because they discovered that there were 18 of these little Anu comprising the atom of hydrogen. And when they investigated helium, they discovered there were 4 times that number of those tiny Anu, 72. And it wasn't long before they realized that there appeared to be 18 times the number of Anu compared with the mass number of the atom itself. Now, the mass number of an atom is the combined number of neutrons and protons. And they thought, right, here's a major investigation that we can embark upon. What happens if we scan through the whole of the known periodic table? And that's what they did. So they spent enormous amounts of time doing this, and they scanned through the known periodic table and got a whole lot of numbers, which then, once this project was done, they then began to compare the accuracy or the correlation between the numbers of Anu and the mass numbers of these atoms. And it turned out to be an extraordinary result. What they found were that for many of those atoms, around about 23, they discovered that they had exactly 18 times the mass number. There were others where it wasn't exactly that, but it wasn't very far off, like it was within 1%, maybe at the most 3% of 18 times the mass number, which for any experiment in psi and clairvoyant experiments is itself extraordinary anyway. Because normally investigators into psi get very excited when they get results that are just a bit over half, in other words, the random chance result. So here's a delightful visualization of the way they perceived the Anu, which was like a delightful little heart-shaped energy form that was spinning like anything, with spirals of energy streaming up the middle, strands of it, and then spiraling back around the outside again, and spiraling back up again up the middle. They found a few elements which were not known at the time, but have since been discovered in terms of isotopes. So that again is quite a remarkable factor in the success or the value of their investigation. So to round that up, it stands as an extraordinary piece of clairvoyant research, and it's my hope that before long this research project, called the Investigation into Occult Chemistry, which is the term they used then, OC or Occult Chemistry, will be known to people like the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Now here's the second of these iconic research programs carried out within the Theosophical Society itself, and this time it was carried out by Geoffrey Hodson, who's very well known in the world of theosophy and this kind of work. He was a noted clairvoyant, writer and speaker. I have to say that his primary fields of investigation were in the intelligences embedded in nature in terms of the Deva kingdom, or angelic kingdom as he called it, or the nature spirits, whom he investigated at great length in a number of books. But he also liked to connect to different professionals in different fields, like musicians and scientists and others. In particular, there was a paleontologist who was very sympathetic to the Theosophical Society. He was involved with it in South Africa, and he's very open to conducting a project with Geoffrey Hodson. Geoffrey Hodson used to like to ask these professionals to put questions to him which had meaning or which were forefronts of discovery in their field, and then he would delve into the field employing his clairvoyant powers. This time, Professor John Robinson asked Geoffrey Hodson if he would investigate the Akashic record associated with bone fragments and fossil fragments of pre-human beings who lived about 500,000 years ago. And Geoffrey said, right, okay, what's involved? Where will we do it? And they decided to do it in one of the caves in South Africa in Sterkfontein, where lots of these fragments and all sorts of pieces were discovered. And here we're showing Dr. John Robinson with a table full of some of these incredible fragments, which were either bits of spinal columns, pieces of teeth, thigh bones, etc., as you see there. The way Geoffrey liked to work with this was to place the fragment on his brow chakra, which is a psychic energy center. He found it very easy to start to be able to tune into the nature of the Akashic record associated with those creatures. He would then chant the sacred word Om, and that would activate the Kundalini energy in his energy system. There's Robinson prepared to take written notes, but they also had a sound recorder going. And if you'd like to listen, we have playing for you here a small fragment of one of those recordings there where he's actually describing what he saw and how he saw it.
They communicated, these creatures, by a kind of gibbering. Can only describe it as gibbering. They had ape-like mouths and very loose lips, and they raised and closed them, showed their teeth, and kind of communicated by some kind of queer sounds and diction. Not words, but gibbering. There was a lot of that went on when one or more gathered together. There were young and there were females. In fact, there was family life of ape-like creatures lived in this region.
We present a few of the results of this clairvoyant research, which were, first of all, correct according to direct established scientific evidence. Now what he's talking about here, these are features of the creature, like whether its jaw was underslung or not, whether it had a prominently developed nose or whether it was a very flat nose, its height and all sorts of other features about its gait, its way that it's moved, its build, etc. like that. And altogether, Geoffrey came across around about 200 different characteristics or features. And this is the breakdown of those features when compared with the known science at the time. Correct and agreeing with unassailable scientific results, 41. Incorrect according to unassailable scientific results, 0. Probably correct, and probably correct because the science is a bit indirect, 20. Can't tell because the science hasn't gone there yet, 51. So he certainly found lots of characteristics, as I said, 200, of which the number that I mentioned a while ago there, 41, was exactly right, compared directly with them, and none wrong. The two results themselves are extraordinary for a piece of psi or psychic research. And again, like the occult chemistry that I mentioned a moment ago, this will stand as a piece of research that once it's known in the field of research into psi will, I think, have profound effects and establish a very valid and very honourable stance for the position of the Theosophical Society in these kind of fields of research. Before we leave you in this particular video, I'd like to just talk a bit about the stance and value of the Theosophical Society itself and the world of science. So remember, this video has been about the evolution of science itself. And having seen Dean Radiner talking about the taboo that's still visibly operating in the world of mainstream science and their attitudes towards consciousness, where they've tended to want to explain it as something that was just a byproduct of the operation of the brain. But the more adventurous and courageous scientists like Dean Radin have been investigating this kind of thing. But going back to a previous video, remember that Edgar Mitchell founded the IONS, which is the Institute of Noetic Science. So they're definitely growing numbers, actually. Oh, another one was the Nassim Haramein, whom we saw speaking earlier in a video there, and they're doing really exciting research in bridging the fields of consciousness, sacred geometry, science itself. So we really are in an extremely interesting time in the evolution of science. As these bridges are built one side to the other, in fact between the three of them, with the merging of the three circles, that we will see extraordinary discoveries, extraordinary integration as these fields of human endeavour merging towards a coherent, balanced view of our place in the universe as beings of consciousness, as also of energy and matter, that I think we're heading towards an extraordinary stage for humanity in the very near future. And so with those notes, I'd just like to close the video and say I've really enjoyed in sharing some of these things. There's much, much more that is yet to share, but feel your appetite whetted and have a look at a few more of our books and videos, and of course the other wonderful organisations which are sharing the search. So thank you very much. Good. Bye for now.